Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's lesson. We're getting so far along in the course, it's getting hard to remember what day we're on. I believe this is day 18. Multiply that by 3, what does that take us to? That's the number of intellectual days we've been together. And you're in the middle of writing an essay. So today's lesson, what I'd like to do is to help you with that thesis statement. I've gone on and I've had a look at people's work today. I've done my best to add some comments and some encouragement for you. You're at different stages of development. Some of you have got like dozens of pieces of evidence to work with, have read both novels, have started to develop thesis statements. Some of you are still developing the evidence, you're a bit behind. But today what I'd like to do is to focus specifically on the thesis statement because that's the entry point to the essay. Once you've got your thesis, you really do have your essay, I believe, because by this time in your evolution as a writer, the writing part is just time and effort, I think, and putting thought into the thesis, but you can't really go in any direction until you have that thesis statement. So before I get to like an example of a thesis statement or how I would go about trying to figure one out, I'd like to address something that I think could help everybody. I had a look at the quizzes for those of you who didn't write the quiz. That was I did that as an attempt to use that feature. The quiz feature will be what I use to put together the final exam for this course. So I'm just sort of like piloting that a little bit. For those of you who did the quiz, thank you very much, and the benefit for doing that is you get a little bit of feedback. So you're able to ask some questions about your novellas, and I've already replied by school email to everybody with my responses to help you out as best as I can. That activity revealed to me that there's a few of you who are still approaching a piece of literature mostly, or at least to a large extent, based on the literal meaning. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you a little bit of an analogy. I've got two toys that I'd like to present to you. This is the first one. Pretty elaborate thing here. We didn't have toys like this back in my day. Watch this. You can't even see it. There it is. Oh yeah. That John Deere sure can hum there. There used to be a song about John Deere tractors when I was in high school. It was popular. I went to Opeongo. Don't judge. That toy is pretty amazing. This is the other toy. See that? Which of those toys is the better toy, do you think? Now, for those of you who are perceptive, you're like, oh, it's a trick. The block is definitely going to be what he's going to try to pull on us. He's going to prove that the block is a better toy. The block is a better toy, but you wouldn't be able to know why it's a better toy. For me, the block holds a lot of meaning. These two toys, they're not mine. Well, the blocks were. They're my son's toys. The John Deere tractor, which is amazing. I mean, look at this thing. It's green, it's stylish, it's got big tires on it. You know, the stereotypical toy for boys. It's got tires, boys will like it. It's a great toy, but it holds no meaning because I didn't buy it for my son. He didn't play with it very much. He didn't seem to like it very much, so it doesn't have any real meaning. There's no real history. The blocks, though, these my grandfather, he passed away when I was overseas, so that's 2004 is the year he passed away. He put it's a big box of just random blocks. He was a carpenter by trade, and he used to keep odds and end blocks for me, and then when I would go to their house, I would build towers out of the blocks, and I would try to impress him by building larger and more elaborate towers every time. My son and I play with these blocks all the time. We build stuff, and we talk as we build, and we have fun, and so they've got meaning for me. And the analogy here that I want to show you is that this comparison is what I'd like to show you. A story, like the literal part of the story, the story part of a piece of literature is kind of like this. It's a good piece of literature should have a good story. It should have a good plot. It should have good characters. It should be interesting to read. But that part really doesn't hold as much meaning. It's this really is what's important when you're approaching a piece of literature. Every piece of literature boils down to an idea. Every great work of art boils down to an idea. That's the difference between the poet and the hack, is the poet has got something to contribute to the world. The hack really doesn't have anything except for, a lot of bells and whistles, all right? It's the difference between watching a great movie and a B movie, which is, they make up for a lack of substance with a lot of sex, violence, and car chases. So the first step to developing a great thesis is understanding what the purpose of literature is. And literature really is about the idea, the underlying figurative level. That's where I want you guys to head. So, what does your novella teach you about suffering? For a few of you, my feedback on your thesis that you're building is it's too simplistic. A thesis, and several of you had a thesis that sounded like both of these novellas show different things about suffering. Well, yes, we know that. I know that because that's why I assigned this assignment. I said, read two of these novellas. They all have something to do with suffering. If someday you go past your bachelor's degree and you go for a master's degree, you're going to be doing original research, and in order to do that, you have to find a gap in our knowledge, human knowledge. The reason why we do research is not to reinvent the wheels. We research into things to answer questions that don't have an answer yet. So you identify a gap and then you try to fill it. That's what you're doing with this essay too. I want you to find a gap and then try to fill that gap. And in order to do that, you have to look deeper than just suffering. What is it that your novella is teaching you about suffering? So let me show you in a little bit more depth how I would approach this activity if King Lear was one of my two works that I was going to be comparing. So I've got some notes here to refer to. So I look at King Lear, I'm looking for suffering. First place I'll look, because suffering has to do with people, I'll look at the characters and I ask myself, what characters suffer in this novel? Well, Lear, Cordelia, Kent, Gloucester, and Edgar all come to mind. Does anything, just looking at that, does anything come to mind? What does Shakespeare teach me about suffering? Well, the first thing I notice is that those are all the good people. Now, I don't know how good you want to say Gloucester is, right? And a case could be made against Lear too, but definitely Cordelia, Edgar, and Kent are good people who end up suffering. We know one of our themes is that your righteousness doesn't shield you from evil or from suffering. Well, why do they suffer? And I might get thinking about, Lear causes Cordelia to suffer and Kent to suffer. He causes their suffering. He causes his own suffering. Well, what's the cause of it? Well, his blindness, right? His blindness to the evil of his other two daughters, his blindness to the fact that Kent and Cordelia are trying to talk sense into him, and that blindness being caused by hubris. Well, maybe I see like a syllogism forming here, like a logical connection that the hubris is causing the blindness, which is causing the suffering. Is that what Shakespeare is trying to teach me about suffering? That ultimately it comes down to hubris. That the hubris of a person is going to, by necessity, lead to suffering. Well, let's see if we can find connections, right? Where is this reinforced? And I want to look deeper than just the surface level. I'm thinking symbols, I'm thinking motifs. What do I see? Well, one thing that comes to mind as a motif, blindness, appears throughout the play. It's not a symbol. Blindness can't be a symbol because it's not a physical thing. It appears throughout. Well, I'm looking specifically at Gloucester being blinded, right? Like physically blinded. That gruesome scene, that cause of his suffering, is that caused by his hubris? Is there a connection there? Well, I think it is, because his hubris, his pride that, well, I'm a nobleman, I can do whatever I want, is the reason why he fathers Edmund, who then sort of like comes back to haunt him. So yes, there's a connection there. What about like his blindness as he's wandering around, and he's suffering, he wants to end his suffering, he's trying to commit suicide. Is like that, is there hubris involved in there too? I think that maybe like he feels like he's too good to live anymore, that he doesn't deserve to suffer, and so he wants to end his pain. Maybe I could connect it that way. So the blindness motif, I think, is something I could latch onto. The storm is a symbol. The storm is a physical thing. We can experience it, right? You can actually, in a sense, like theoretically, you could touch the storm if you were up in the clouds. I would call it more of a symbol than a motif. But you could look at it as being a motif. You could look at it as being imagery as well. It's not really described though, so it doesn't count so much as imagery. But regardless, the storm, is there a connection there? Well, I think the storm is pathetic fallacy, right? We see, Lear is going out of his mind in his state of suffering, having been kicked out of his kingdom, essentially. And that storm is reflecting the inner storm that's going on as he's losing his sanity. We know that it was his hubris, this idea that, I am going to be king without the responsibility, and you will give me 100 knights to follow me around. I mean, talk about hubris, talk about excessive pride. Like, I need 100 knights to follow me around just to like show how important I am. So we've got the connection there too. Is there anything else we can latch on to? We see characters, we see this pathetic fallacy, we see motifs. Is there anything else in the play that we could latch onto and say, this hubris is causing the blindness, which is then causing the suffering? That's the type of thinking that you want to do as you're trying to develop a thesis statement that's worth defending. Remember that your thesis statement, the value of it, depends on whether or not, number one, you can defend it, but also, is it worth defending? Like, if my thesis statement is that there is suffering in King Lear, that is not worth defending. It's just way too obvious, right? So you want to have something that's more than just, there is suffering in these two novels. Look carefully at what your evidence is pointing at. If you have a lot of evidence related to suffering, and then you put thought into it, and this is what's really important, you have to think carefully about your evidence. That's what analysis is. Analysis just means reading and thinking at the same time. You think carefully about this evidence, and you should be able to deduce a thesis statement. The goal is, by today, you should have your thesis statement, and with that thesis statement, you'll be able to then move forward with your essay.